The river that ran past the outskirts of town had always been placid, lapping lazily at its clay banks and reflecting the old willow trees. The locals were used to its steady rhythm, to its grumbling in the spring when the ice cracked and drifted downstream. But this year everything was different. No one noticed as the water began to rise. First slowly, then with a greedy, relentless force. The dam that had held the river in check for decades developed a crack. In the dead of night, as the town slept, a low rumble echoed, as if the earth had sighed, and the water surged, sweeping everything in its path. Lights flickered on in the houses, and shouts mingled with the roar of a torrential downpour that had been falling for 3 days. People ran out into the darkness, grabbing children, documents, bags of their most valuable possessions. Eleanor Davidson, a 70-year-old retired teacher, stood by her front gate, clutching an old photo album to her chest. Her fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the fear that the water would take what was left of her life. Her neighbors shouted, "Run, Elle, run!" She glanced back at her house, at the flowers in the front garden she'd planted with her husband, and stepped into the night, where the flashing lights of rescue workers were already visible. No one thought about the dog. Buddy, an old mutt with faded brown fur, was left in the yard of the Miller family's house. His rusty, heavy chain was fastened to a post by a leaning fence. The Millers, a family of 3, were in a panic, gathering their things, shouting at each other, shoving suitcases into the car. "Where are the keys? Where's my passport?" The wife wailed as her husband tried to start their old Ford. Their son, a teenager, silently dragged bags without looking up. Buddy whined, thrashing against his chain, but no one heard him. The water was already reaching his paws, cold, murky, and smelling of silt. When the Miller's car finally screeched away, the dog lunged after it, but the chain yanked him back, digging into his neck. Eleanor, making her way toward a rescue truck, turned at the sound. Her gaze swept over the Miller's yard, where something flashed in the darkness. A shadow, a movement. She squinted, but the rain obscured her vision, and the flashlight in her hand shook. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice swallowed by the noise of the crowd. She knew that dog. She'd seen him lying by the fence, seen the Millers toss him a bowl of leftover food. No one called him by name, no one petted him. He was just part of the yard, like the old shed or a rusty bicycle. Eleanor swallowed a lump in her throat and turned away. She had to go. The rescue workers were already shouting, "Hurry, the water's rising." By morning, the town had become a chaotic scene. Water flooded the streets, and houses tilted like weary old men. The dam had completely given way, and the river, as if freed from chains, devoured everything in its path. Buddy was alone. The chain he was tied to snapped under his desperate lunge. The metal cracked, and the dog, limping, scrambled onto a wooden fence that was miraculously still holding above the water. His claws dug into the rotting wood, his fur was soaked, and his body trembled with cold. He looked in the direction where the people had disappeared, where the lights of the cars had flickered. There was no hope in his eyes, but there was something stubborn, almost human. The will to live. The water rose, licking at the fence, and he clung to it for as long as he could. Eleanor sat in the rescue truck, clutching the album to her chest. Her house was already under water, but she wasn't thinking about it. An image of Buddy, of his dark eyes that always watched her as she walked by, spun in her head. "Why didn't I stop?" she whispered, staring out the murky window. The rain drummed on the roof, drowning out her voice but not her sense of guilt. She knew the dog was there alone, and no one would come back for him. No one but her. The evacuation center, set up in the town school, buzzed like a disturbed hive. People who had lost their homes sat on cots, covered with thin blankets, whispering about what would happen next. The rain still drummed on the roof, muffling the voices of the rescuers who were handing out hot tea and bread. Eleanor sat in a corner on a hard wooden bench, pressing the old photo album to her chest. Her wrinkled fingers stroked the worn cover. But her thoughts were not on the past captured in the faded photographs. They were on the dog she had left at the fence. Buddy. His dark eyes, always looking with a silent plea, haunted her. She closed her eyes, and that night came back to her. The dog's shadow flickering in the darkness, his whimper drowned out by the sound of the water and the cries of the people. "Why didn't I stop?" she whispered. Her voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. Buddy hadn't been anyone's pet. His story began 10 years ago when the Millers, then a young family, moved to the town. The puppy, thin with a shabby tail and a wet nose, had been howling under their gate, shivering from the cold. Anna Miller, the wife, had looked at him with annoyance but still threw him a crust of bread. "Let him live, we need a dog in the yard," her husband, Pete, grumbled. And Buddy stayed. Not as a family member or a friend but as a thing that had a function to serve. He was tied to a post with a rusty chain, given an old blanket by the shed, and forgotten. They fed him scraps, sometimes forgetting to fill his water bowl. They gave him a name by chance, without love, the way you'd name an old stool or a rusted lock. "Buddy, to your spot!" they'd shout if he dared to come too close to the porch. No one petted him, scratched him behind the ear, or looked him in the eyes. He was a shadow in the yard, an invisible presence that was always there but never a part of their lives. Eleanor knew this story. She often passed the Miller's house on her way back from the store or from her garden, where she would work in the beds to distract herself from her loneliness. Buddy was always lying by the fence. His brown fur blended with the ground, and his eyes, dark and deep, followed her. There was no malice in them, only a quiet, almost human sadness. Sometimes she would stop, take a piece of bread, a cookie, or even a piece of sausage she had saved for herself out of her bag, and toss it over the fence. "Here you go, Buddy," she'd whisper. And the dog would cautiously take the treat, wagging his tail. These moments were their little secret. She never told her neighbors. She was afraid the Millers would condemn her for her foolish sentimentality. But deep down, she felt that Buddy understood her better than many people. He was just as lonely as she was. Forgotten, unwanted, but still waiting for some warmth. Her life after the death of her husband, George, had become empty, like a field in winter. George had been her support, her laughter, her home. When he died of a heart attack 5 years ago, Eleanor felt like she had lost a part of herself. Her children had moved away, her grandchildren rarely called, and the town where she had lived all her life seemed strange to her. Only Buddy, lying by the Miller's fence, reminded her that she was still alive. One day last autumn, she was sitting on the bench by her house, looking at the fallen leaves. Buddy, as if sensing her mood, came over and lay down at her feet. He didn't ask for food or wine. He just looked at her as if to say, "I'm here." It was then that she first thought that this unwanted dog was closer to her than many people in town. She wanted to take him in, but she always stopped herself. What will the Millers say? And how would I manage on my own? When the ice started to break up, no one in town thought the river would overflow. "The dam is strong," Pete Miller said, standing on his porch and looking at the murky water. Anna, his wife, bustled around the house, grumbling at their son Adam, who was always on his phone. Buddy, as always, lay by the fence. His fur was soaked from the rain, and his chain rattled as he tried to find a dry spot. That night, when the dam collapsed, the Millers were too busy with themselves. Anna was screaming, gathering clothes and documents. Pete was cursing, trying to get the car out of the mud. And Adam was silently staring out the window, as if he had already accepted the loss of their home. Buddy thrashed against his chain. His whimpering was drowned out by the noise of the rain and human panic. The chain dug into his neck, leaving bloody marks, but he lunged forward, toward where the people were disappearing, where the car lights were flashing. Eleanor could not find peace in the evacuation center. Her neighbor, Aunt Mary, tried to comfort her. "Eleanor, stop torturing yourself. The house is gone. What else is there to think about?" But Eleanor only shook her head. She remembered how Buddy had looked at her that night, how his shadow had flickered by the fence. She could have stopped, could have untied him, but she didn't. Why? Because she was afraid of getting delayed. Because she thought the Millers would take care of him. Her chest tightened and she turned to the window, where the rain was still falling, washing away the last traces of their former lives. "I should have saved him," she whispered. Her voice trembled like a branch in the wind. Buddy hung from the fence. His paws slipped on the wet wood. The water was rising, cold and merciless, licking at his claws. He no longer howled or barked. He had almost no strength left. But in his eyes a stubborn, almost human spark burned. He looked toward the road where the people had disappeared and where the lights had flickered. He didn't know if anyone was waiting for him there, but he clung on for as long as he could. In the evacuation center, Eleanor stood up, ignoring Aunt Mary's surprised look. She approached a rescue worker, a young man with tired eyes. "There's a dog left on the Miller's fence," she said. Her voice was firm despite the trembling in her hands. The man frowned. "Ma'am, we're barely getting people out. Where's a dog?" She clenched her fists. "He's there, I saw him." The rescue worker sighed but wrote down the address. "If we get a chance, we'll check," he grumbled, but there was no hope in his tone. Eleanor returned to the bench, her heart pounding. She knew the chances were slim, but she couldn't sit idly by. Buddy was her guilt, her debt, her last connection to something living. The water in the town was still rising, carrying away pieces of fences, children's toys, and someone's memories. Buddy clung to the rotting wood. His body trembled with cold, and the blood from his cut paws mixed with the murky water. He didn't know how much longer he could hold on, but in his old, tired heart, a spark was flickering. Not hope, but something deeper that forced him to hold on despite the pain, despite the loneliness. He waited for someone to remember. The water in the town of New Haven did not recede. The third day of the flood turned the town into a murky sea, where the roofs of sheds, the tops of trees, and leaning fences protruded from the water. Rescue boats went back and forth, pulling people from flooded houses, but there were fewer and fewer of them. Many had already been evacuated, and those who remained clung to the last remnants of hope. The evacuation center at the school buzzed with the sounds of crying and weary conversations. Eleanor sat on the same bench, squeezing her photo album, but her gaze was fixed on the window. The rain had subsided, but the sky remained as gray as her thoughts. She hadn't slept for 2 nights, tormented by the thought of Buddy. His dark eyes, his shadow by the fence, his silent struggle. All of it gave her no peace. "I should have gone back," she whispered. Her voice trembled like a thin branch in the wind. The center was stuffy, smelling of wet clothes and the cheap soup volunteers were handing out. Eleanor listened as the rescue workers discussed where else to look for people. "The Millers are safe. Their house is under water," one of them said, and her heart tightened. She wanted to ask about Buddy, but the words stuck in her throat. Who would look for a dog when people were losing everything? She bowed her head, feeling the guilt eating away at her from the inside. Yesterday, she had tried to convince a rescue worker to check the Miller's yard, but he had just shrugged. "Ma'am, there's nothing to save there anymore." She didn't believe it. Buddy was alive. She knew it, felt it, just as a mother knows her child is still breathing. On the third day, a new volunteer arrived at the center, a man in his 40s with a tired face and a teenage son who held his hand. The boy, named Alex, was thin with messy hair and large gray eyes. He silently helped his father hand out blankets, but his gaze kept returning to the window, where the outlines of the flooded town were visible through the murky glass. They had come from a neighboring town to help, but Alex seemed to be looking for something of his own. When his father went with another group of rescuers, the boy stayed in the center, sitting by the window. Eleanor noticed him. He wasn't like the other teenagers, who were either whining or hiding behind their phones. There was something mature, almost sad in his eyes. Alex watched the street where the water swirled, carrying away debris. His father told him that the flood had taken homes, livestock, and cars. But the boy couldn't stop thinking about those who were not counted, about the animals that had been abandoned. At home, they had a cat named Whiskers whom Alex had rescued from a basement 2 years ago. He knew what it meant to be forgotten. When his father returned from another trip, Alex tugged on his sleeve. "Dad, can I go with you? I want to see." His father frowned but nodded. "Just stay close." They got into a boat that glided through the flooded streets of New Haven. Alex peered into the murky water, where planks, plastic bottles, and someone's jacket floated. His heart pounded. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he felt he had to. And suddenly, at the turn to the miller's house, he saw him. On a leaning fence barely held above the water, a dog hung. His paws clung to the rotting wood. His fur was matted with dirt, and his body trembled. Alex froze. His breath caught in his throat. "Dad, there's a dog on the fence," he shouted, pointing at Buddy. His father squinted but shook his head. "Alex, that's impossible. No one could have survived there." But the boy didn't listen. His eyes burned. "I saw him, he's alive." The rescuers exchanged glances, but no one moved. The boat was already turning to go further. Alex clenched his fists. He couldn't explain why this dog was so important, but he felt he had to do something. "I'll do it myself," he yelled, and without listening to his father, he jumped into the water. The cold was a stinging shock, but he swam, grabbing onto the planks floating around him. The water was up to his chest, and the current pulled him back, but Alex didn't stop. He saw Buddy, his paws slipping on the fence, his eyes where there was no strength left. "Hold on, please," the boy whispered, fighting the current. Meanwhile, Eleanor stood at the window of the evacuation center. Her heart tightened when she heard shouts outside. She ran out onto the porch, ignoring Aunt Mary, who tried to stop her. Through the sheet of rain, she saw a boat and a boy swimming toward the miller's flooded yard. "Buddy!" she gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. The rescuers were shouting at Alex to come back, but he didn't listen. Eleanor took a step forward. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't look away. This boy, whom she had just met, was doing what she hadn't had the courage to do. Alex reached the fence. Buddy was already slipping. His claws scraped the wood, leaving bloody marks. He didn't howl or bark. He just hung there, as if he had accepted that the water would take him. The boy swam closer. His hands were shaking from the cold, but he pulled a rope from his pocket that he had taken from his father. "Hold on, dog, hold on," he whispered, tying the rope around Buddy. The dog didn't move, his eyes were half closed, but Alex felt that his body was still warm. He pulled the rope, fighting the current, and slowly led Buddy toward the boat. The rescuers finally came closer and helped haul the dog on board. Buddy lay on the bottom of the boat, wet and shivering with cut paws. Alex sat next to him, his hand stroking the matted fur. "You're a good boy," he whispered, and his voice trembled. Buddy slowly opened his eyes, as if in disbelief. There was no hope in his gaze, but there was relief. Eleanor watched the boat returning to shore. Her heart was beating so hard she could barely breathe. She recognized Buddy even from that distance. "He's alive," she whispered, and tears streamed down her cheeks. She didn't know who this boy was, but in that moment, he was a miracle to her, something she hadn't dared to ask from fate. The evacuation center in New Haven was filled with a weary silence. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only occasional drops trickling down the murky windows. Eleanor stood on the porch. Her fingers still clutched the photo album, but her gaze was fixed on the boat that had moored at the makeshift bank. The rescue workers carried Buddy, wet, trembling, his paws covered in bloody scrapes. Alex, the boy who had saved the dog, walked beside them. His clothes were soaked through, and his face glowed with a mix of exhaustion and relief. Eleanor stepped forward. Her heart pounded as if it were about to burst from her chest. "Buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know how to thank this boy. Didn't know how to explain why this dog was so important to her. But there was something more in his rescue than just the life of a dog. It was her own hope, her chance to atone for her guilt. Buddy lay on the bottom of the boat. His body was cold, almost lifeless. When Alex had reached him at the fence, the dog was already slipping. His claws had been scraping the wet wood in vain. He didn't howl or bark. He just hung there, as if he had accepted that the water would take him. Alex, fighting the current, had tied the rope around him, whispering, "Hold on, please, hold on." His hands had been shaking, water had streamed into his eyes, but he pulled the dog toward the boat, feeling him grow heavier with every movement. The rescuers finally came closer and helped haul Buddy aboard. The dog collapsed on the floor. His chest barely rose. Alex sat next to him, stroking his matted fur. "You're a good boy," he repeated, his voice trembling with cold and emotion. Buddy slowly opened his eyes, as if he couldn't believe he was still alive. His gaze, dull but alive, met the boy's eyes, and something new flashed in it. Not fear, not expectation, but relief. Eleanor watched the scene from the porch. Her legs were trembling, but she forced herself to approach the boat. The rescuers, busy with their work, paid no attention to her. Alex, noticing her, looked up. "Is this your dog?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only tired curiosity. Eleanor shook her head, feeling tears sting her eyes. "Not mine, but I know him. Buddy. He was the miller's dog." She fell silent, unable to explain why she felt so guilty, and why this dog had become something more to her than just a mutt. Alex nodded as if he understood. "He's strong. He didn't give up until the very end," he said, and his words struck her to the core. The rescuers carried Buddy to a corner of the evacuation center, where volunteers had set up a makeshift veterinary station. A young woman, a volunteer named Katie, leaned over the dog. Her hands moved quickly but carefully. She cleaned his wounds, put an IV in, and covered him with an old blanket. "He's badly malnourished and hypothermic. His paws are in a terrible state," she said, not looking up. "But he's a survivor. If he makes it through the night, there's a chance." Eleanor stood nearby, her fingers fiddling with the edge of the album. "He'll make it," she whispered. And it wasn't just a wish, it was a prayer. She couldn't lose him. Not now that he was so close. Alex sat next to Buddy, not leaving his side. His father, returning from another trip, frowned when he saw his son next to the dog. "Alex, you're all wet, you'll catch a cold," he said, but the boy just shook his head. "I'll stay. He's scared." Eleanor looked at Alex and her heart tightened. This boy, whom she barely knew, had done what she hadn't had the courage to do. She walked up to him, her voice quiet but firm. "Thank you, Alex. You saved him." The boy shrugged, but his cheeks flushed. "I just saw him. I couldn't not help." The night in the evacuation center was long. Eleanor couldn't sleep, sitting on the bench next to Buddy. His breathing was shallow but steady. Katie, the volunteer, checked the IV and changed the bandages on his paws. "He's a fighter," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice. Eleanor nodded, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered how Buddy had watched her through the fence, how he wagged his tail when she threw him bread. She remembered how her husband, George, loved animals, how he once brought home a kitten he found in a field. "Eleanor, everyone needs warmth," he had said. And now those words echoed in her head like a rebuke. Why hadn't she taken Buddy in earlier? Why hadn't she insisted that the Millers let him go? Her fingers tightened on the album, and she felt tears welling up in her eyes again. Buddy lay under the blanket, his eyes closed, but his chest slowly rose and fell. Alex, sitting beside him, was whispering something that Eleanor couldn't make out. She looked at the boy and the dog, and something new grew in her chest. Not just guilt but determination. She couldn't change the past, but she could do something now. "Hold on, buddy," she whispered. Her voice was filled with the same strength that had once helped her survive the death of her husband. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. This dog should not be left alone. By morning, Buddy was still breathing. His paws were bandaged, his fur was dry, but he looked as fragile as a cracked branch. Katie, the volunteer, smiled at Eleanor. "He's a good boy. If he keeps this up, he'll make it." Eleanor nodded, but her gaze was fixed on Alex, who was sleeping curled up next to the dog. This boy, a stranger yet so familiar in his kindness, was a reminder to her that miracles happen even on the darkest of days. She looked at Buddy and thought that maybe he had not only saved himself but also her from loneliness, from emptiness, from the feeling that she was no longer needed by anyone. The morning at the New Haven Evacuation Center was quiet, almost reverent. The rain had stopped, and the first rays of the sun broke through the ragged clouds, reflecting in the puddles that covered the schoolyard. Eleanor sat at the makeshift veterinary station, where Buddy lay on an old mattress. His fur, still damp, had been carefully brushed by volunteers, and his bandaged paws looked as fragile as dry twigs. The fur connected to his front paw slowly dripped, and every movement of his chest, weak but steady, was a miracle to Eleanor. She hadn't left his side all night. Her fingers still clutched the photo album, but now it lay on her lap like a talisman, not a burden from the past. Her eyes, red from tears and sleeplessness, watched Buddy, as if she were afraid he would disappear if she looked away. Buddy had survived. It was more than Eleanor had dared to hope for. The volunteer, Katie, checking his condition in the morning, smiled. "He's strong. His paws are healing, and his temperature has gone down. A couple more days on the 4, and I think he'll be on the mend." Eleanor nodded, but her throat tightened. She wanted to say something to thank her, but the words were stuck. Instead, she touched Katie's hand and whispered quietly, "Thank you." Katie, tired but with a warm smile, squeezed her shoulder. "It's all because of your boy. Alex didn't let us lose him." Alex, the skinny teenager with the large gray eyes, was more than just a hero to Eleanor. He was a reminder that kindness doesn't depend on age. After saving Buddy, he came to the center every day, bringing old books that he would read aloud to the dog. His voice, clear but soft, echoed in the corner where Buddy lay. He read everything from fairy tales about Jack and the Beanstalk to a battered book about space he had found in the school library. "Look, Buddy, it's about stars. Maybe you came from there?" he'd say, and the dog, as if understanding, would slightly twitch his ears. Eleanor listened, sitting nearby, and her heart was filled with tenderness. She watched as Alex petted Buddy, as he carefully adjusted the blanket, and she thought that this boy had given her not only a dog but also faith in people. The evacuation center gradually emptied. People were returning to the remains of their homes or leaving to stay with relatives in nearby towns. The Millers, whose house was completely destroyed, went to stay with Anna's sister in the county seat. Eleanor saw them at the center on the second day, but they didn't say a word about Buddy. Anna, her eyes red from crying, complained about her lost belongings. Pete silently smoked by the entrance, and their son Adam looked at the floor. Eleanor wanted to ask why they had abandoned the dog, but she couldn't bring herself to do it. She knew the answer. Buddy had never been alive to them. He was just a chain by the fence, a shadow that you don't notice until it's gone. Eleanor remained at the center, even though her own house was also flooded. Her neighbor, Aunt Mary, urged her to go stay with her daughter in the city. "Eleanor, why are you sitting here? Everything is gone. It's time to think about yourself." But Eleanor shook her head. "I can't, Mary. I can't leave him. Aunt Mary sighed but didn't argue. She saw how Eleanor looked at Buddy, how her face brightened when the dog opened his eyes. This wasn't just a dog. It was her connection to something bigger, to what she had lost after her husband's death, to what she was afraid she would never find again. A week later, Buddy began to stand. His movements were slow, unsteady, but every step was a victory. Alex, sitting nearby, clapped his hands. "Buddy, come on, you can do it." The dog, hearing his voice, would turn his head, and a new spark appeared in his eyes. Not the one that burned on the fence, full of despair, but a different one, calm, almost grateful. Eleanor watched them, and her heart was filled with warmth. She remembered how her husband, George, had said, "Eleanor, life isn't about what you lose. It's about what you save." At the time, she hadn't understood his words, but now, looking at Buddy, at Alex, at her own wrinkled hands that could still hold on, she felt that he had been right. One evening, Alex came with his father. His face was serious, almost grown up. He sat next to Buddy, petted him, and turned to Eleanor. "My dad and I talked. I want to take him home." Eleanor froze. Her fingers clenched the album. She had been expecting this, but she still felt a pang in her chest. Buddy deserved a home, a real one with warmth and care, which she, in her flooded world, might not be able to provide. But the thought of the dog leaving was almost unbearable. She looked at Alex, at his sincere eyes, and nodded. "You're a good boy, Alex. He'll be happy with you." Alex smiled, but there was a shadow of sadness in his smile. "You'll come visit. He knows you." A month later, Buddy, still limping but with healed paws, stepped into his new home. It was a small house in the neighboring town with a front garden and an old porch. Alex placed a mat for him by the door and put down a bowl of water and food. "Buddy, this is your home," he said, and for the first time in his life, the dog lay down not to guard but to be close. He looked at Alex, at his father, at a world that was no longer cold, and his tail quietly thumped against the floor. Eleanor came that day, holding a new album in her hands. She had left the old ones in the past, along with her guilt. She petted Buddy for the first time without fear that he would disappear, and whispered, "You're home, boy." Eleanor returned to New Haven, where a new life was beginning. Her house was destroyed, but she decided to stay, to help rebuild the town, plant new flowers, and live. Alex called her, telling her how Buddy was running around the yard, how he slept by his bed, and every time she heard his voice she smiled. Buddy, the dog no one called by name, had become a lesson for her. Not everyone in this world is saved, but sometimes one is enough. One dog, one boy, one spark to believe that life still has meaning.